In Chicago's smoky clubs where jazz weaves with secrets, young singer Lila Moreau performs tales of love and dreams. Her voice is velvet, but her past hides danger. Mysterious millionaire Theo Carver enters her life with a revelation that changes everything. Blackmail, betrayal, a lost family. Their meeting ignites passion and peril beneath crystal chandeliers. Can they uncover the truth buried in the shadows? It's a story of love and danger, where every note leads to redemption. I present to you the audiobook, Velvet Spotlight. Chapter 1. Velvet and Shadows. The air in the Nightingale Club throbbed, a living thing fueled by the pulse of the jazz band and the murmur of 100 conversations, all vying to be heard above the intoxicating chaos. Smoke, thick with the scent of expensive perfume and illicit whiskey, curled around the crystal chandeliers, casting a hazy glow over the scene. Lila Moreau stood poised on the small, elevated stage, a single spotlight illuminating her like a captured star. Her dress, a shimmering cascade of emerald sequins, clung to her curves, the color of vibrant contrast, to the creamy skin of her shoulders and the dark, expertly waved hair that framed her face. She was 21, but the smoky depths of her eyes held a wisdom, a weariness, that hinted at a life lived far beyond those years. Her voice, when it emerged, was the reason people packed the Nightingale night after night. It wasn't just a voice, it was an experience. Velvet, smooth and rich, with a hint of a rasp that spoke of late nights and whispered secrets. It wrapped around the notes of the bluesy melody, caressing them, teasing them, until they surrendered to her command. Tonight it was stormy weather, and Lila poured every ounce of her orphaned heart, every flicker of ambition, every shadowed memory into the song. She'd learned early that life was a stage, and you had to sing your heart out, even if the audience was indifferent, even if your own heart was breaking. The orphanage, with its cold stone floors and echoing silence, had taught her that. The years spent scrubbing floors and dreaming of a life beyond those gray walls had forged a steel core beneath her delicate exterior. Chicago, with its dazzling lights and dangerous undercurrents, was her escape, her chance to rewrite her story. The Nightingale was her stepping stone. Her gaze swept across the room, taking in the glittering gowns and tailored tuxedos, the flash of diamonds and the glint of gold cufflinks, the usual mix of socialites, businessmen, and the shadowy figures who seemed to thrive in the dimly lit corners. She sang for them all, but her true audience, the one she craved approval from, was always somewhere beyond the reach of the spotlight. A ghost of a smile, a memory of a lullaby, fragments of a past she could barely grasp, yet they fueled her every performance. Then she saw him. He wasn't a part of the usual crowd. He sat at a secluded table near the back, the shadows clinging to him like a second skin. He wasn't boisterous like the others, fueled by bootleg liquor and the thrill of the forbidden. He was quiet, intense, his presence a stark contrast to the surrounding revelry. He was impeccably dressed, a dark suit that seemed to absorb the light, a stark white shirt, and a tie the color of midnight. His face was lean, with sharp cheekbones and a strong jaw, his hair dark and neatly combed, but it was his eyes that captured her attention. They were a deep, penetrating gray, and they were fixed on her with an unwavering intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't the leering gaze she sometimes encountered. It was something else, something that felt like recognition. For a beat, the music faltered. The trumpet's wail seemed to hang in the air, suspended, as Lila's voice caught in her throat. She felt a sudden, inexplicable pull toward this stranger, a feeling as potent and unexpected as a shot of raw whiskey. He didn't clap, didn't smile, didn't even blink. He simply watched her, his gaze a silent challenge, a silent question. She recovered quickly, her training kicking in. She forced her voice back on track, channeling the tremor in her heart into the song's mournful lyrics. But the connection remained, an invisible thread stretching between them across the crowded room. She felt exposed, vulnerable, as if he could see past the carefully constructed facade she presented to the world, past the glittering dress and the practiced smile, straight into the heart of the girl who still dreamed of a life beyond the shadows. As the final notes faded, a wave of applause washed over her. She offered a small, practiced curtsy, her smile a little brighter now, a little more genuine. But her eyes sought him out again. He was still there, still watching. He raised his glass, a crystal tumbler filled with amber liquid, in a silent toast. A ghost of a smile played on his lips, a hint of something that might have been admiration, or perhaps something more. A waiter, his face flushed with exertion, approached the stage, a small, folded piece of paper clutched in his hand. "Miss Moreau," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the din. "A gentleman requested I deliver this to you." Lila took the note, her fingers trembling slightly. She unfolded it carefully, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The handwriting was elegant, precise, the ink a deep, rich black. "Meet me at the back entrance after your set. I have something of yours. T.C." The initials were like a spark, igniting a firestorm of curiosity and apprehension within her. T.C. Theo Carver. The name whispered through the club like a secret, a legend. The millionaire, the enigma, the man who could make or break careers with a single word. The man who was now waiting for her. The man who claimed to have something of hers. What could he possibly have? She racked her brain, trying to recall any interaction, any lost item, any connection that could explain this cryptic message. Nothing. She had lived a careful, controlled life, her past locked away, her future meticulously planned. The band struck up another tune, a faster, more upbeat number. Lila knew she should prepare for her next set, should focus on her performance, on her ambition. But the note, the mysterious T.C., the unwavering gaze from the shadows, it had all thrown her off balance. Her carefully constructed world had tilted on its axis. And as she stepped back into the spotlight, she knew that her life, her carefully planned future, was about to change forever. The velvet curtain had risen on a new act, and she had no idea what role she was meant to play. But one thing was certain. She was no longer just singing for the crowd. She was singing for him. Chapter 2. The Millionaire's Gaze. The back entrance of the Nightingale was a stark contrast to the opulent glamour of the main room. A narrow alleyway, smelling of stale beer and damp concrete. It was lit only by a single, flickering gas lamp that cast long, dancing shadows. The sounds of the city, the rumble of passing cars, the distant clang of a trolley, the occasional shout filtered in, a reminder of the world that existed beyond the club's intoxicating embrace. Lila pulled her velvet shawl tighter around her shoulders, a shiver running down her spine that had nothing to do with the cool night air. He was waiting for her, leaning against the brick wall, one hand tucked casually into his pocket. The dim light obscured his features, but she recognized the sharp lines of his suit, the way he held himself, that quiet intensity that had drawn her in from across the crowded room. He was even taller than she'd realized, his presence dominating the narrow space. "Mr. Carver?" she asked, her voice a little unsteady. He straightened, pushing himself away from the wall. As he stepped closer, the gaslight illuminated his face, and Lila felt a renewed jolt of that strange, inexplicable pull. His eyes were even more striking up close, a deep, stormy gray that seemed to see right through her. "Miss Moreau," he replied, his voice low and smooth, with a hint of something that might have been amusement. "Thank you for meeting me." "Your note was intriguing," Lila said, trying to maintain a semblance of composure. "You said you had something of mine." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch. It was a deep, rich purple, the color of amethyst, and it was tied with a thin gold cord. Lila's breath caught in her throat. She knew that pouch. She hadn't seen it in years, but she recognized it instantly. This is mine," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But how?" He held the pouch out to her, his fingers brushing hers as she took it. The touch sent a shiver of electricity through her, a sensation that was both unsettling and exhilarating. "It was found among my father's belongings," he said, his voice devoid of any inflection. "He passed away recently." Lila's heart sank. She remembered Mr. Carver, a kind, gentle man who had occasionally visited the orphanage when she was a child. He had always brought small gifts, sweets and books, and he had always taken the time to talk to her, to ask about her dreams. He was one of the few bright spots in her otherwise bleak childhood. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "He was a good man." Theo Carver nodded, his gaze softening slightly. "He was. He spoke of you often. He remembered your voice, your love of music." Lila opened the pouch, her fingers trembling. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded cotton, was a small silver locket. It was shaped like a heart, and it was engraved with a single, delicate rose. She hadn't seen this locket since she was 10 years old, since the day she'd been told she was being sent to the orphanage. She'd clung to it, a tangible reminder of her mother, of a life she could barely remember. Then one day it had disappeared. She'd searched everywhere, heartbroken, but it was gone. "I thought I'd lost it forever," she said, her voice choked with emotion. She looked up at Theo Carver, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and confusion. "But why did your father have it?" He hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers. "That's a complicated story," he said. "One that I'm not entirely sure I understand myself." He paused, and the silence stretched, filled only with the sounds of the city and the frantic beat of Lila's heart. "My father was involved in certain dealings," he continued, his voice low and guarded. "Dealings that were not always above board. He kept many secrets, Miss Moreau, and I suspect this locket is connected to one of them." Lila's mind raced. The orphanage, Mr. Carver's visits, the lost locket, Theo Carver's mysterious presence. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle, scattered and disjointed, but somehow connected. "What kind of dealing?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at her then, his gaze intense and unwavering. "The kind that can get people killed," he said bluntly. "The kind that involve blackmail, betrayal, and a great deal of money." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. "I believe my father was being blackmailed, Miss Moreau, and I believe that whoever was blackmailing him is also connected to you, to your past, to this locket." Lila felt a chill run down her spine. This was more than she had bargained for. She had come to Chicago to escape her past, to build a new life, to become a star. She hadn't expected to be drawn to a world of secrets and danger, a world where the stakes were far higher than a standing ovation. "I don't understand," she said, shaking her head. "I don't know anything about blackmail or any of this." "Perhaps not consciously," Theo Carver said, his eyes searching hers. "But I believe you hold the key, Miss Moreau. The key to unraveling this mystery, to finding out who was blackmailing my father and why. He paused, his gaze softening slightly. "I need your help, Lila," he said, her name a soft caress on his lips. "Will you help me?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. It was a request, but it was also a challenge, an invitation, a promise of something more. Lila looked at him, at the intensity in his eyes, at the vulnerability that flickered beneath his carefully controlled exterior. She knew that saying yes would change her life forever, that it would plunge her into a world of danger and uncertainty. But she also knew that she couldn't say no. She had to know the truth about her past, about the locket, about the connection to this enigmatic millionaire. And perhaps, just perhaps, she had to know more about the man himself. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rumble of a passing truck. "I'll help you." A flicker of a smile crossed his lips, a hint of relief, of gratitude. "Thank you," he said. "I believe we'll make a formidable team, Miss Moreau." He offered her his arm, a gesture that was both old-fashioned and surprisingly intimate. Lila hesitated for a moment, then slipped her hand through his arm. His touch was warm, firm, and reassuring. As they walked out of the alleyway and into the night, Lila knew that she had stepped onto a stage far more dangerous, far more thrilling than any she had ever known. The spotlight was on her, and the stakes were higher than she could have ever imagined. The game had begun. Chapter 3. Spilled Secrets, Spilled Drinks. The Nightingale was even more raucous on Lila's second set. Word of Theo Carver's presence had spread like wildfire through the club, adding an extra layer of excitement, of speculation, to the already charged atmosphere. Every eye seemed to be on him, on the secluded table where he sat, nursing a single drink, his gaze fixed on Lila. She tried to ignore him, to focus on her performance, but his presence was a constant distraction, a magnetic pull that she couldn't resist. She sang St. Louis blues, pouring her newfound anxieties and uncertainties into the song's melancholic lyrics. She sang of lost love, of betrayal, of the shadows that lurked beneath the surface of even the brightest lights. Her voice, usually so confident, so controlled, trembled slightly, betraying the turmoil within her. As she finished the song, a wave of applause erupted, but it was cut short by a commotion near the front of the stage. A woman, her face flushed with anger and too much champagne, stumbled forward, knocking over a table laden with drinks. Glasses shattered, ice scattered, and a crimson stain spread across the pristine white tablecloth like a spilled secret. The woman was Clara Beaumont, a socialite known for her sharp tongue, her jealous nature, and her unrequited infatuation with Theo Carver. She was dressed in a shimmering silver gown that rivaled Lila's own, but her beauty was marred by the petulant expression on her face. You, she slurred, pointing a trembling finger at Lila. "You think you're so special, don't you? You think you can just waltz in here and steal everyone's attention?" Lila stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. She had encountered jealous rivals before, women who resented her talent, her beauty, her rising star. But Clara Beaumont was different. She was powerful, connected, and she was clearly unhinged. "I don't know what you're talking about," Lila said, trying to maintain a calm facade. "Don't play innocent with me," Clara hissed, her voice rising above the murmurs of the crowd. "I saw you with him. I saw the way he looked at you. He's mine, you hear me? Mine." She lunged forward, her hand raised, as if to strike Lila, but before she could connect, a figure moved with lightning speed, intercepting her. Theo Carver stood between them, his arm a steel barrier, his expression cold and dangerous. "That's enough, Clara," he said, his voice low and firm. "You're embarrassing yourself." Clara's face crumpled, her bravado dissolving into tears. "Theo," she sobbed. I just—" "Go home, Clara," he said, his voice devoid of any sympathy. "And sober up." He turned to Lila, his gaze softening slightly. "Are you all right?" he asked. Lila nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She was shaken, not just by Clara's outburst, but by Theo's swift intervention, by the way he had protected her. He turned back to Clara, his expression hardening again. "And if I ever see you treat Miss Moreau with disrespect again," he said, his voice low and menacing, "you'll regret it. Do you understand?" Clara, thoroughly humiliated, nodded miserably and stumbled away, her friends rushing to her side, their whispers a mixture of pity and schadenfreude. The crowd, which had been holding its breath, collectively exhaled. The band, sensing the shift in mood, struck up a lively tune, trying to restore the festive atmosphere. Theo turned back to Lila, his gaze searching hers. "I apologize for that," he said. "Clara can be unpredictable." "It's all right," Lila said, her voice still a little shaky. "I'm used to jealous women." "You shouldn't have to be," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. He reached out and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her forehead. The touch sent a shiver of electricity through her, a sensation that was becoming increasingly familiar, increasingly difficult to ignore. "Let's get out of here," he said, his voice low and intimate. "I think we've both had enough of the Nightingale for one night." He didn't wait for her reply. He took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring, and led her through the crowd towards the back entrance. The murmurs followed them, a wave of speculation and gossip. Lila felt a mixture of apprehension and excitement. She was stepping into the unknown, into a world of secrets and danger, with a man she barely knew, a man who was both intriguing and unsettling. As they stepped out into the cool night air, Lila couldn't help but wonder what awaited her. Clara Beaumont's outburst, the spilled drinks, the spilled secrets, it all felt like a prelude, a warning of the storm to come, and she knew with a certainty that sent a shiver down her spine that she was right in the middle of it. Chapter 4. A Dance of Whispers. Theo's car, a sleek black Duesenberg, was parked a short distance from the Nightingale, a silent testament to his wealth and power. It gleamed under the streetlights, a symbol of the world he inhabited, a world that was so different from Lila's own. He opened the door for her, his hand hovering protectively at her elbow as she slid onto the plush leather seat. The interior smelled of expensive leather and a hint of sandalwood, a scent that was both sophisticated and subtly masculine. He started the engine, the powerful motor purring to life, and they pulled away from the curb, leaving the noise and chaos of the Nightingale behind. The city streets, still bustling with activity even at this late hour, unfolded before them, a panorama of glittering lights and shadowy corners. "Where are we going?" Lila asked, her voice a little hesitant. "Somewhere we can talk," Theo replied, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "Somewhere private." He drove in silence for a while, navigating the streets with an effortless grace. Lila watched him, studying his profile in the dim light. He was a man of secrets, she knew, a man of hidden depths, but there was also a vulnerability about him, a hint of sadness that she found both intriguing and unsettling. He pulled up in front of a grand, imposing building on a lakeshore drive, its windows glowing warmly against the night sky. It was a luxury apartment building, one of the most exclusive addresses in the city. "This is your home?" Lila asked, a little surprised. He nodded. "One of them," he replied, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. He led her through the opulent lobby past a uniformed doorman who greeted him with a respectful nod and into a waiting elevator. The ride was swift and silent, the only sound the soft hum of the machinery. His apartment was on the top floor, a sprawling space with breathtaking views of Lake Michigan. The living room was decorated in a style that was both elegant and understated, with plush velvet furniture, antique rugs, and original artwork on the walls. A fire crackled merrily in the fireplace, casting a warm glow over the room. "This is beautiful," Lila said, her voice filled with genuine admiration. "Thank you," Theo replied. "I find it peaceful." He gestured towards a pair of velvet armchairs facing the fireplace. "Please sit down." Lila sat sinking into the soft cushions. Theo poured 2 glasses of brandy from a crystal decanter on a nearby table and handed one to her. "To new beginnings," he said, raising his glass in a toast. Lila echoed the toast, the brandy warming her throat, calming her nerves. He sat down opposite her, his gaze intense and unwavering. "Now," he said, "let's talk about that locket." Lila took a deep breath, trying to collect her thoughts. The events of the evening, Clara Beaumont's outburst, Theo's protective intervention, the journey to his luxurious apartment, it had all left her feeling overwhelmed, disoriented. "I told you, I thought I'd lost it forever," she said. "I haven't seen it since I was a child." "But you remember where you got it?" Theo asked, his voice probing. Lila nodded. "My mother gave it to me," she said. "It was the only thing I had left of her after she died." She hesitated. The memory is painful, even after all these years. "She was a singer, too," she continued, her voice a little choked with emotion. "She sang in a small club, not like the Nightingale. She wasn't famous, but she had a beautiful voice." "And your father?" Theo asked, his voice gentle. Lila shook her head. "I never knew him," she said. "My mother never talked about him. It was a secret." A secret. The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Lila looked at Theo, her eyes searching his. "You said your father was being blackmailed," she said, "and that it was connected to me, to the locket. How?" Theo leaned forward, his gaze intense. "My father kept a journal," he said. "A very detailed journal. He wrote about everything, his business dealing and his personal life, his secrets." He paused, his gaze shifting away from hers. "After he died, I started going through his things, trying to make sense of it all. That's when I found the locket and the journal entry that mentioned it." "What did it say?" Lila asked, her heart pounding in her chest. Theo hesitated, his expression troubled. "It was cryptic," he said. "He wrote about a woman, a singer, with a voice like velvet. He wrote about a locket, a promise, a debt that had to be paid. A voice like velvet." Lila felt a chill run down her spine. He was talking about her mother. "He didn't mention her name?" she asked. Theo shook his head. "No," he said. "But he described her, her appearance, her voice. It was unmistakable. He was obsessed with her. Obsessed." The words sent a shiver of unease through Lila. She looked at Theo, her mind racing. Do you think your father was my father?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Theo looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and uncertainty. "I don't know," he said. "It's possible, but there's more." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small, folded piece of paper. It was a photograph, old and faded, but the image was still clear. It showed a young woman, standing on a stage, a microphone in her hand. She was beautiful, with dark hair and striking eyes. She was wearing a dress that shimmered in the light. Lila gasped. It was her mother. She recognized the dress, the locket around her neck, the look in her eyes. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice trembling. It was tucked inside the journal, Theo replied, along with this. He handed her another piece of paper. It was a letter, handwritten in a delicate, flowing script. The ink was faded, but the words were still legible. My dearest love, I know this is dangerous, but I had to see you. I had to tell you, I'm carrying your child. Lila's world tilted on its axis. The room spun, the fire blurred, and she felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She clutched the letter, her hands shaking, her mind reeling. Her mother, pregnant, with Theo Carver's father's child. It was too much, too shocking, too unbelievable. A dance of whispers, indeed. And the music was just beginning. Chapter 5. The Socialite's Venom. The revelation hung in the air, thick and suffocating, like the smoke that had curled around the chandeliers of the Nightingale. Lila stared at the letter, at the faded photograph, her mind struggling to grasp the implications. Her mother, pregnant, with Theo Carver's father's child. It meant that Theo Carver might be her brother? Half-brother? She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and disbelief. He was watching her, his expression unreadable, his gray eyes clouded with uncertainty. I don't know what to say, she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. Neither do I, Theo admitted, his voice equally subdued. This changes everything. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration, of bewilderment. I knew my father had secrets, he continued. But this is beyond anything I could have imagined. He stood up and walked over to the window, staring out at the glittering expanse of Lake Michigan. The city lights reflected in the dark water, creating an illusion of infinite depth, of hidden mysteries. Lila remained seated, clutching the letter and the photograph, her mind racing. The implications of this discovery were staggering. It would rewrite her past, her identity, her entire understanding of who she was. It would also complicate her relationship with Theo Carver, a relationship that had already been fraught with tension, with an undeniable attraction that she couldn't ignore. We need to find out the truth, she said, her voice gaining strength. We need to know what happened to my mother, to the child, to everything. Theo turned back to her, his gaze softening slightly. I agree, he said. But it won't be easy. My father was a powerful man, and he had many enemies. Whoever was blackmailing him, they're still out there. He paused, his expression hardening. And I suspect Clara Beaumont knows more than she's letting on. Lila's mind flashed back to the scene at the Nightingale, to Clara's jealous outburst, to her venomous words. She had dismissed it at the time as the rantings of a spoiled socialite, but now she wasn't so sure. You think she's involved? Lila asked. Theo nodded. She was obsessed with my father, he said. And she's clearly jealous of you. I wouldn't put anything past her. He walked back to the fireplace and poured himself another brandy, his movements stiff and controlled. We need to be careful, Lila, he said. We're dealing with dangerous people. He was warning her, she knew, but there was also something else in his voice, a hint of protectiveness, of concern. It was a subtle shift, but it was there, and it sent a shiver of warmth through her, a feeling that was both comforting and unsettling. The next morning, Lila awoke to a barrage of phone calls. The news of her encounter with Theo Carver and Clara Beaumont's subsequent meltdown had spread through the city like wildfire. The gossip columns were buzzing, the rumors flying, and Lila's name was on everyone's lips. She tried to ignore it, to focus on her music, on her upcoming performances at the Nightingale. But it was impossible. The whispers followed her everywhere, the speculation growing wilder with each passing hour. She received a visit from the club's owner, a gruff, imposing man named Sal DeMarco. He was concerned not just about the negative publicity, but about the potential threat to his business. "Lila, you gotta be careful," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Carver's a powerful man, and he's got powerful enemies. You don't want to get caught in the crossfire." He paused, his gaze softening slightly. "You're a talented girl, Lila," he continued. "You've got a bright future ahead of you. Don't let this mess ruin it." His words were a warning, but they were also a show of support. He believed in her talent, and he didn't want to see her get hurt. Later that day, Lila received another visitor, one she hadn't expected, Clara Beaumont herself. She arrived at Lila's small apartment unannounced, her demeanor surprisingly subdued. She was dressed in a simple, elegant dress, her usual flamboyant jewelry conspicuously absent. "Miss Moreau," she said, her voice polite, almost contrite. "May I come in?" Lila hesitated, unsure of what to expect, but she couldn't deny the curiosity that gnawed at her. She stepped aside, allowing Clara to enter. The apartment was small, but it was clean and tidy, a reflection of Lila's organized, disciplined life. It was a stark contrast to Clara's opulent world, to Theo Carver's luxurious penthouse. I wanted to apologize," Clara said, her voice trembling slightly, "for my behavior at the Nightingale. It was unforgivable." She looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting nervously. "I was drunk," she continued, "and I was jealous. I've been in love with Theo for years, and I couldn't stand the thought of him being with someone else." Lila listened in silence, her expression guarded. She didn't trust Clara, not entirely, but she also sensed a vulnerability in her, a hint of genuine remorse. "I know that's no excuse," Clara continued, "but I wanted to explain. I wanted you to know that I'm not your enemy." She looked up at Lila, her eyes filled with a mixture of pleading and desperation. "I know about your mother," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "And I know about the baby." Lila's breath caught in her throat, so it was true. Clara did know something. The socialite's venom had struck, and Lila's carefully constructed world was about to be shattered once again. The game, it seemed, was far from over. Chapter 6. Echoes of an Orphan's Dream. Lila stared at Clara, her mind reeling. The confirmation, so blunt, so unexpected, sent a wave of emotions crashing over her: shock, disbelief, and a flicker of anger. How do you know?" Lila asked, her voice trembling despite her effort to control it. Clara looked down, twisting a delicate handkerchief in her hands. "My father and Theodore Carver Sr. were associates," she said, choosing her words carefully. "They were involved in many business ventures together, some less savory than others." She paused, taking a deep breath. "I overheard conversations, whispers, things I wasn't supposed to hear. My father was very discreet, but sometimes he'd had too much to drink. He'd talk." "About my mother?" Lila pressed, her heart pounding. Clara nodded. "He mentioned a singer, a woman Carver was infatuated with, a woman who had a child." "Your mother? And the blackmail?" Lila asked, remembering Theo's words. Was my mother blackmailing his father? Clara hesitated, her gaze shifting away. I don't know the details," she said. "But I know there was money involved, a lot of money, and I know that Carver Sr. was desperate to keep it quiet." Lila felt a surge of anger, a fierce protectiveness towards the mother she barely remembered. So he paid her off to disappear, to abandon her child? "I don't know," Clara repeated, her voice laced with a hint of genuine regret. "I truly don't. I wish I did. I feel partly responsible. My family benefited from Carver's wealth, from his connections. And if that wealth was built on hurting your mother, She looked up at Lila, her eyes filled with a surprising vulnerability. "I'm not like my father, Miss Moreau," she said. "I'm not like Theo's father either. I want to help you. I want to find out the truth, just as much as you do." Lila studied her, trying to discern whether her words were genuine or another carefully crafted performance. There was a desperation in Clara's eyes, a plea for understanding that seemed real. But could she trust her? Could she trust anyone? "Why?" Lila asked, her voice still guarded. "Why would you help me? After everything?" Clara sighed. "Because I loved Theo," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "And I know that he cares for you. I see the way he looks at you. It's the way he used to look at me. Before." She trailed off, her gaze drifting towards the window, towards the distant skyline. "I've made a lot of mistakes, Miss Moreau," she continued. "I've been selfish, jealous, vindictive. But I'm not evil, and I want to atone for my father's sins, for my own." She turned back to Lila, her expression resolute. "I have access to information," she said. "My father kept records, letters, documents, things that might shed light on what happened. I can help you find them." It was a tempting offer, a dangerous one. Trusting Clara Beaumont was a risk, a gamble. But Lila was desperate for answers, desperate to uncover the truth about her past, about her mother's fate. "What do you want in return?" Lila asked, her voice wary. Clara shook her head. "Nothing," she said. "Just a chance to make things right. A chance to earn your forgiveness." The silence stretched between them, filled only with the distant sounds of the city. Lila considered her options, weighing the risks against the potential rewards. She had come to Chicago to escape her past, to build a new life. But the past had found her, had drawn her into a web of secrets and lies. And she knew that she couldn't move forward until she had untangled the threads, until she had uncovered the truth. "All right," Lila said, her voice firm. "I'll accept your help, but if you betray me, Clara, if you're lying—" Clara met her gaze, her eyes unwavering. "I understand," she said. "I won't betray you, Miss Moreau. I swear it." A tentative alliance had been formed, a fragile truce between two women who had been rivals, who were now bound together by a shared quest for the truth. It was an unlikely partnership, a dangerous one, but it was Lila's best hope, perhaps her only hope, of uncovering the secrets that had haunted her for so long. The echoes of her orphaned dreams resonated within her, urging her forward, pushing her to confront the shadows of her past, to find the answers she so desperately sought. And she knew, with a growing certainty, that the journey would be perilous, that the truth would be painful, but that she had to see it through, no matter the cost. Chapter 7. Beneath the chandelier's glow. Theo was waiting for her at the Nightingale. He stood near the stage, his presence a quiet force amidst the usual pre-show bustle. The club was still hours away from opening, the tables empty, the chairs stacked, the only light filtering in from the street, and the single bare bulb illuminating the stage. He turned as she approached, his gray eyes searching hers. He'd been informed of Clara's visit. Lila had called him immediately after the socialite's departure, relaying the shocking conversation and the uneasy alliance they had formed. "How are you holding up?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. Lila managed a small smile. "I've been better," she admitted. "But I'm determined to find out the truth. And Clara, she might actually be able to help." Theo's expression remained skeptical. "Clara Beaumont is a master manipulator, Lila," he warned. "Don't trust her too easily." "I know," Lila said. "But she has access to information that we need. Her father's records, they could hold the key." She paused, her gaze drifting towards the stage, towards the spot where she had stood just a few nights before, her world seemingly intact. "It's all so complicated," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "My mother, your father, a child, blackmail, it's like a twisted melodrama." Theo stepped closer, his hand gently touching her arm. "We'll figure it out, Lila," he said, his voice reassuring. "Together, we'll find the truth." His touch sent a familiar shiver through her, a warmth that spread through her veins, momentarily easing the anxieties that had been swirling within her. She looked up at him, at his strong jaw, his intense eyes, the hint of vulnerability that he tried so hard to conceal. The possibility that he might be her half-brother was still a raw, unsettling thought. But it didn't diminish the pull she felt towards him, the connection that had been there from the moment they first met. "Sal wants to see you," Theo said, changing the subject. "He's in his office." Lila nodded, grateful for the distraction. She followed Theo through the empty club, towards the back, towards Sal DeMarco's office. The room was small and cluttered, filled with stacks of papers, overflowing ashtrays, and framed photographs of famous jazz musicians. Sal sat behind his desk, his face grim, a half-smoked cigar clenched between his teeth. "Lila," he said, his voice gruff. "Sit down." She sat, her heart pounding. She knew this wasn't going to be a pleasant conversation. "The rumors are flying," Sal said, his gaze fixed on her. "About you, Carver, the Beaumont girl. It's bad for business, Lila. Real bad." He paused, taking a long drag on his cigar. "I've got investors breathing down my neck," he continued. "They're worried. They're talking about pulling out." Lila felt a wave of guilt wash over her. She had brought this trouble to the Nightingale, to Sal, to the musicians who depended on the club for their livelihood. "I'm sorry, Sal," she said, her voice low. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." "I know you didn't," Sal said, his voice softening slightly. "But you gotta understand, Lila. This is a dangerous game you're playing. Carver's a powerful man, and he's got powerful enemies. You're caught in the middle." He removed the cigar from his mouth. "I have to protect my interests and my staff." Lila's heart sank. She knew what was coming. "I had to make a choice," he continued, and confirmed Lila's fears. "I have to take time off," Sal said, his voice flat. A lump formed in her throat, and tears of fear threatened to fall. "I understand. I'm sorry, kid," he said. "But it's the only choice. Until this mess gets cleared, I can't risk it." "I won't be gone too long," Lila promised him, gathering courage. "I'll fix this." Theo, who had been standing silently by the door, stepped forward. "She won't be alone, Sal," he said, his voice firm. "I'll make sure she's protected." Sal looked at him, his expression unreadable. He knew Theo Carver's reputation, his power, his influence. He also knew that getting involved with Carver was a double-edged sword. "Just be careful, Lila," Sal said, his voice a mixture of warning and concern. "Both of you." They left Sal's office, the weight of his words heavy on their shoulders. Lila felt a mixture of despair and determination. She had lost her job, her livelihood, her dream, but she had also gained something, a sense of purpose, a resolve to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. As they walked back towards the main room, Theo stopped, his hand gently touching her arm. "Don't worry, Lila," he said, his voice low and intimate. "We'll get through this, and you'll sing again. I promise you." He looked at her, his gray eyes filled with a warmth, a sincerity that took her breath away. He believed in her talent, in her strength. And in that moment, standing beneath the dim glow of the empty club, Lila felt a flicker of hope, a spark of resilience that refused to be extinguished. The chandelier above them, though unlit, seemed to shimmer with a promise of its own, a promise of a future where the shadows would be banished and the music would play on. Chapter 8. The Blackmail Shadow. Following Clara's instructions, Lila and Theo found themselves in the cavernous basement of the Beaumont Mansion, a sprawling estate on the outskirts of Chicago. The air was thick with dust and the scent of mildew, a stark contrast to the opulent grandeur of the house above. Rows of shelves lined the walls filled with boxes, trunks, and forgotten relics of a bygone era. Clara, surprisingly efficient, had located a section dedicated to her father's business records. She moved with a purpose, her initial nervousness replaced by a determined focus. It was clear she knew this place, knew the secrets it held, even if she hadn't fully explored them before. "My father was meticulous," she said, her voice echoing in the vast space. "He kept everything. Contracts, letters, financial statements. It's all here." She pointed to a stack of dusty boxes, their labels faded and illegible. "These are from the period when your mother was involved with Carver Sr., she said, her voice hesitant. Theo, his expression grim, started opening the boxes, carefully sifting through the contents. Lila watched him, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. They were searching for a ghost, for a woman she had never known, for a story that had been shrouded in secrecy for over 2 decades. Hours passed, filled with the rustle of paper, the occasional cough, and the growing tension in the air. They found ledgers filled with cryptic entries, contracts with unfamiliar names, and letters that hinted at illicit deals and hidden agendas. But nothing that directly mentioned Lila's mother, nothing that explained the blackmail, the lost locket, the abandoned child. Lila felt a wave of frustration wash over her. She had hoped for a quick resolution, a clear answer, but it was becoming increasingly clear that the truth was buried deep, hidden beneath layers of deception and carefully constructed lies. As the afternoon wore on, Theo discovered a small, locked wooden box tucked away in a corner. It was heavier than the others, and it was secured with a sturdy brass lock. "This might be it," he said, his voice tight with anticipation. He tried to force the lock, but it wouldn't budge. Clara, rummaging through a nearby drawer, produced a small, rusty key. "Try this," she said, her voice hopeful. "My father had a key for everything." The key fit, and with a click, the lock sprung open. Theo carefully lifted the lid, revealing the contents within. It wasn't documents, as they had expected, but a collection of personal items. A faded silk scarf, a pair of worn leather gloves, a silver cigarette case engraved with the initials T.C., Theodore Carver, Sr. And then they saw it. A photograph, tucked beneath the other items. It was a picture of Lila's mother, the same woman from the photograph Theo had found in his father's journal. But this picture was different. It was more intimate, more personal. She was smiling, her eyes sparkling with happiness, and she was holding a baby in her arms. Lila gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. It was her. She was the baby in the photograph. She recognized the locket around her mother's neck, the same locket that had been found among Carver Sr.'s belongings. Theo carefully lifted the photograph, his fingers trembling slightly. On the back, written in the same delicate script as the letter they had found, were the words, "My beloved son, Thomas. A reminder of the love we shared, a love that can never be. Thomas." So the baby's name was Thomas, Lila's brother, her half-brother. A brother she had never known, a brother who had been lost, just like her. Beneath the photograph, they found another letter. This one was different. It wasn't written in the flowing script of Lila's mother. It was typed, formal, and it was addressed to Theodore Carver, Sr. "Mr. Carver, we are in possession of certain information regarding your relationship with Miss Eleanor Moreau and the birth of your illegitimate son. This information, if made public, would be damaging to your reputation, to your business interests, to your family. We are prepared to remain silent in exchange for a substantial sum of money. The details of the payment will be communicated in due course. Failure to comply will result in the immediate release of this information to the press. You have been warned. The shadow. The blackmail letter. Lila felt a chill run down her spine. The shadow. Who were they? What did they want? And what had happened to her brother, to Thomas? Theo carefully folded the letter, his expression grim. This changes everything, he said. This isn't just about my father's past. It's about a conspiracy, a deliberate attempt to erase your mother, to erase your brother from existence. He looked at Lila, his eyes filled with a fierce determination. We need to find out who the shadow is, he said. And we need to find out what happened to Thomas. Clara, who had been standing silently by, watching them, stepped forward. I might know someone who can help, she said, her voice hesitant. Someone who knew my father, who knew Carver Sr., someone who was involved in their world. She paused, her gaze shifting away. He's a dangerous man, she said. But he might have information. He might know who the shadow is. Lila and Theo exchanged a look. They were stepping into deeper, darker waters, into a world of shadows and secrets where the stakes were higher than they could have ever imagined. But they had come too far to turn back. They had to find the truth, no matter the cost. The blackmail's shadow loomed large, but they were determined to step out of its darkness and into the light. Chapter 9. A Night of Reckoning. Clara's contact was a man named Silas, a shadowy figure who operated in the murky underworld of Chicago's illicit businesses. He was a fixer, a go-between, a man who knew everyone and everything, a man who could make problems disappear for a price. They met him in a dimly lit speakeasy, a hidden establishment tucked away in a back alley, far from the glittering lights of the Nightingale. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of cheap liquor, the music a low, bluesy lament. Silas sat in a secluded booth, his face obscured by the shadows, his presence radiating an aura of danger and quiet menace. He was a large man with a scarred face and cold, calculating eyes. He didn't offer them a greeting, didn't even look at them directly. He simply gestured towards the seats opposite him, his silence a clear indication that he was in charge. Clara, visibly nervous, introduced Lila and Theo, explaining their quest for information, their search for the shadow, for the truth about Lila's mother and her lost brother. Silas listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When Clara finished, he finally spoke, his voice a low, gravelly growl. Carver Sr., he said, his voice laced with contempt. A powerful man, a ruthless man. He made a lot of enemies. He paused, his gaze shifting towards Lila. And your mother. She was a beautiful woman, a talented woman. She got caught in his web. Do you know what happened to her? Lila asked, her voice trembling. Do you know what happened to her, child? Silas leaned back, his eyes narrowing. I know things, he said. But information comes at a price. Theo stepped forward, his expression firm. We're prepared to pay, he said. Within reason. Silas chuckled, a harsh, humorless sound. Reason is a relative term, Mr. Carver, he said. Especially in my world. He paused, his gaze sweeping over them, assessing them, calculating their worth. The shadow, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. That's a name that's whispered in the darkest corners of the city. A name that's feared, even by those who consider themselves fearless. Who is it? Lila pressed, her voice urgent. Silas hesitated, his eyes flickering towards the entrance of the speakeasy, as if expecting someone to appear. "It's not a single person," he said. "It's an organization. A group of individuals, powerful individuals, who control a lot of things in this city. They're involved in everything: bootlegging, gambling, prostitution, blackmail. And my mother, my brother, they were victims of this organization?" Lila asked. Silas nodded. "Carver Sr. crossed them," he said. "He tried to break free from their control, and they retaliated. They used your mother, your brother, as leverage." "But what happened to them?" Theo demanded, his voice rising. "Where are they?" Silas looked at them, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and warning. "Some questions are best left unanswered," he said. "Some doors are best left unopened." He paused, his gaze hardening. "I can tell you this," he continued. "Your mother, she's gone. She disappeared shortly after the blackmail letter was sent. No one knows what happened to her. No one who's willing to talk anyway." Lila felt a wave of grief wash over her, a crushing sense of loss. She had never known her mother, but she had always held on to the hope, the dream, that she might still be alive somewhere. "And my brother?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Thomas? What happened to him?" Silas hesitated again, his gaze shifting away. He was taken," he said, "by the shadow. They used him as a bargaining chip to keep Carver Sr. in line." "But where is he now?" Theo demanded. "Is he alive?" Silas looked at them, his eyes filled with a dark, unsettling knowledge. "I don't know," he said. "And frankly, I don't want to know. Some things are best left buried." He stood up, signaling that the meeting was over. "I've told you all I can," he said. "Now get out of here. And be careful. You're playing with fire. You're stirring up things that are best left undisturbed." They left the speakeasy, the weight of Silas's words heavy on their shoulders. They had gained some information, some insight into the dark forces that had shaped their lives, but they were still far from the truth. They knew that Lila's mother was gone, that her brother had been taken, that the Shadow was a powerful, dangerous organization. But they still didn't know who was behind it, what their ultimate goal was, or what had happened to Thomas. As they walked back to Theo's car, Lila felt a surge of anger, of determination. She wouldn't give up. She wouldn't let the Shadow win. She would find out the truth, no matter the cost. She would avenge her mother, and she would find her brother, if he was still alive. "We're not done," she said, her voice firm. "We're just getting started." Theo looked at her, his eyes filled with admiration and a hint of concern. "I know," he said, "but we need to be careful, Lila. We're dealing with powerful enemies, enemies who won't hesitate to eliminate anyone who gets in their way." He paused, his hand gently touching her arm. "I won't let anything happen to you, Lila," he said, his voice low and intense. "I promise you." His words, his touch, sent a familiar shiver through her, a warmth that spread through her veins. But this time, the warmth was mixed with a growing sense of dread, of foreboding. They were walking into a storm, a night of reckoning, and they had no idea what awaited them. The shadows were closing in, and the game was about to become even more dangerous. Chapter 10. Starlight and Cigarette Smoke. The information Silas had provided, however cryptic, gave them a new direction. They knew the Shadow was an organization, not an individual, and that it had deep roots in Chicago's underworld. Theo decided their next step was to investigate his father's known associates, those who might have had connections to the illicit activities Silas had mentioned. He spent hours poring over his father's old address books, ledgers, and correspondence, searching for names, for clues, for anything that might lead them to the Shadow. Lila, meanwhile, researched the city's history, delving into newspaper archives, old city directories, and historical society records, looking for any mention of the organization, any hint of its existence. They worked late into the night, fueled by coffee and a shared determination. Theo's apartment became their headquarters, the living room transformed into a makeshift war room, littered with papers, documents, and photographs. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the scent of old paper, the silence punctuated by the rustle of turning pages and the occasional muttered exclamation. As they delved deeper into the investigation, the lines between their personal lives and their shared quest began to blur. The possibility that they might be half-siblings, a question that had once loomed large, now seemed secondary to the urgency of their mission. They were partners, allies, bound together by a shared sense of purpose, by a growing affection that neither of them could deny. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace, exhausted but determined, Theo found a name that seemed to jump off the page. It was a name that appeared repeatedly in his father's correspondence, a name that was often associated with cryptic references to investments and arrangements. Alden Croft, Theo said, his voice tight with anticipation. I've seen this name before. He was a business associate of my father's, a very close associate. Lila leaned closer, her eyes scanning the documents. What kind of business? She asked. Theo hesitated. I'm not sure, he said. But it was sensitive, confidential. My father never talked about it openly. He paused, his gaze shifting towards the window, towards the glittering expanse of Lake Michigan. I remember Croft, he continued. He used to come to our house when I was a child. He was a cold man, a powerful man. He always made me feel uneasy. Lila felt a shiver run down her spine. Do you think he's involved? She asked. Do you think he's part of the shadow? Theo nodded. It's possible, he said. He certainly fits the profile. Wealthy, influential, connected, and ruthless. They decided to investigate Croft further, to find out everything they could about him, his business dealings, his connections. Lila, using her contacts in the city's entertainment world, started asking questions, discreetly probing for information. Theo, using his family's name and his own considerable influence, started making inquiries in the city's financial circles. Their investigation led them to a lavish estate on the North Shore, a sprawling mansion surrounded by manicured lawns and high stone walls. It was Alden Croft's residence, a symbol of his wealth and power. They decided to pay him a visit unannounced. They knew it was a risky move, but they were running out of options. They needed to confront Croft, to see if he would reveal anything, to see if he was indeed a member of the shadow. As they drove up the long, winding driveway, Lila felt a growing sense of apprehension. The mansion loomed before them, imposing and forbidding, its windows dark and unwelcoming. Are you sure about this, Theo? She asked, her voice hesitant. He nodded, his expression grim. We have to do this, Lila, he said. We have to find out the truth. He parked the car in front of the mansion, and they stepped out into the cool night air. The sky was clear, filled with a million stars, their light a stark contrast to the darkness that surrounded them. As they approached the front door, Lila noticed a figure standing in the shadows watching them. It was a man, tall and imposing, his face obscured by the darkness. Mr. Carver, the man said, his voice low and menacing. Miss Moreau, Mr. Croft is not expecting visitors. Theo stepped forward, his voice firm. We need to speak with him, he said. It's important. The man didn't move. Mr. Croft is not available, he said. I suggest you leave. Lila felt a surge of anger, of defiance. We're not leaving, she said, her voice rising. We know about the shadow. We know about my mother. We know about my brother." The man's eyes narrowed, his gaze flickering towards the house. "You know nothing," he said. "And you're trespassing. Leave now, or I'll call the police." Theo stepped closer to the man, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous murmur. "We're not afraid of the police," he said. "And we're not afraid of Croft. Tell him we're here. Tell him we know." The man hesitated, his gaze shifting between Theo and Lila. He was clearly weighing his options, calculating the risks. Suddenly, the front door of the mansion swung open, and a figure stepped out into the light. It was Alden Croft, his face a mask of cold fury. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice sharp and commanding. "Who do you think you are, barging onto my property?" Theo and Lila stood their ground, their gazes fixed on Croft. The confrontation they had sought was finally here. The starlight above them seemed to shimmer with anticipation, with the promise of a revelation, of a reckoning. The shadows were about to be illuminated, and the truth, however painful, was about to be revealed. Chapter 11. The Price of Fame's Embrace. Croft's appearance was, as Theo remembered, severe and imposing, with a chillingly calm demeanor that suggested a man accustomed to control and power. His eyes, a steely gray, much like Theo's, narrowed as he assessed them, lingering on Lila with a flicker of something unreadable. "Mr. Carver," Croft acknowledged, his voice smooth yet edged with steel. "And Miss Moreau. To what do I owe this unexpected intrusion?" "We know about the shadow, Mr. Croft," Theo stated, his voice equally controlled. "We know about your involvement with my father and with Lila's mother." Croft raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Indeed? And what makes you think I have any knowledge of these allegations?" "We have proof," Lila interjected, stepping forward. "Letters, a photograph. We know about the blackmail, about the child." Croft's composure didn't falter, but a flicker of something annoyance, perhaps, or a hint of caution crossed his features. "You have a vivid imagination, Miss Moreau. Your profession, I suppose, lends itself to dramatics." "This is no performance, Mr. Croft," Theo said. "We know about Thomas. Where is he?" The name spoken aloud in the stillness of the night seemed to hang in the air. Croft's eyes flickered towards the imposing figure who still stood guard, a silent communication passing between them. "I have no idea what you're talking about," Croft said, his voice regaining its smooth, dismissive tone. "I suggest you leave before I have you both arrested for trespassing." "We're not leaving until we get answers," Lila insisted, her voice trembling slightly but filled with a newfound determination. "My mother. What happened to her?" Croft sighed, a theatrical gesture of impatience. "Your mother, Miss Moreau, was a complication, a mistake. My association with your father was purely business. Any personal entanglements were his own doing." "You're lying," Theo accused, his voice rising. "You were involved. You were part of the shadow. You orchestrated the blackmail, the disappearance." Croft smiled, a chilling, humorless expression. "You have no proof, Mr. Carver, only speculation, and the fantasies of a nightclub singer." He turned to the imposing figure beside him. "See them out," he ordered, "and ensure they don't return." The man stepped forward, his hand reaching inside his jacket, a clear threat. Lila felt a surge of fear, but she stood her ground, refusing to be intimidated. Suddenly a voice interrupted them, coming from the doorway of the mansion. "Alden, what is going on here?" A woman emerged, her figure silhouetted against the light spilling from the house. She was older, her hair silvered, but her bearing was regal, her presence commanding. It was Mrs. Croft, Alden's wife. Croft's demeanor changed instantly. His cold fury was replaced by a veneer of polite concern. My dear, he said, his voice softening. It's nothing, just some misguided individuals making wild accusations. Mrs. Croft approached them, her gaze sweeping over Lila and Theo with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Accusations? She asked, her voice sharp. About what? Croft hesitated, clearly reluctant to explain. But Lila, sensing an opportunity, stepped forward. About my mother, Mrs. Croft, she said, her voice clear and strong. About a child, a blackmail. About secrets that your husband has been keeping for over 20 years. Mrs. Croft's eyes widened slightly, her gaze shifting from Lila to her husband. Alden? She questioned, her voice laced with disbelief. Croft's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked like a trapped animal, cornered and desperate. It's true, isn't it? Mrs. Croft said, her voice rising. You were involved. You knew about the child. About the woman. Croft finally found his voice, but it was weak, pleading. My dear, it was a long time ago, he said. It was a mistake. I did what I had to do to protect our family, our reputation. Protect us? Mrs. Croft scoffed, her voice filled with scorn. By lying? By blackmailing? By what else, Alden? What else have you done? She turned to Lila, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and sorrow. I didn't know, she said, her voice trembling. I had no idea. My husband, he keeps things from me. He always has. She drew herself together with a visible, deliberate effort to maintain composure. What do you know about Thomas? She asked Lila. Lila and Theo exchanged a glance. This was an unexpected turn of events, a crack in Croft's armor, an opportunity to get closer to the truth. We believe he was taken, Lila said, by the shadow to control Mr. Carver, Sr. Mrs. Croft's face paled. Taken, she whispered. But where is he now? Is he... We don't know, Theo said. That's what we're trying to find out. Mrs. Croft looked at her husband, her eyes filled with a mixture of disgust and despair. Alden, she said, her voice low and menacing. Tell them everything. Croft stood frozen, his face a mask of defeat. He knew he was cornered. His secrets, his lies were about to be exposed. The price of fame's embrace, the cost of his ambition, was about to be paid in full. The carefully constructed world he had built was crashing down around him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Chapter 12. A Promise in the Dark. Croft, cornered and defeated, finally broke. Under the weight of his wife's accusing gaze and the relentless pressure from Lila and Theo, he confessed. His confession, however, was not a torrent of remorse, but a slow, grudging release of information, each word extracted like a painful tooth. He admitted to being a key member of the Shadow, a clandestine organization that controlled much of Chicago's underworld. He confirmed that Carver Sr. had become entangled with them through various illicit business ventures, and that Lila's mother, Eleanor Moreau, had been used as a pawn in their power games. She was a liability, Croft said, his voice devoid of emotion. Carver was obsessed with her, and he was becoming unpredictable. We needed to control him. So you blackmailed him, Theo said, his voice tight with anger. You used his child, his son, as leverage. Croft nodded. It was effective, he said. Carver paid for a while. He kept quiet. But what happened to Eleanor? Lila asked, her voice trembling. What happened to my mother? Croft hesitated, his gaze shifting away. She disappeared, he said. We arranged it. We made it look like she had run away. Left the city. You killed her, Lila accused, her voice rising. You murdered her. Croft shook his head. No, he said. We didn't kill her. We relocated her. Sent her away. Somewhere she couldn't cause any trouble. Where? Theo demanded. Where did you send her? Croft remained silent, his lips pressed together in a thin line. He was willing to confess to his involvement in the shadow, to the blackmail, but he was still holding something back. Mrs. Croft, who had been listening in stunned silence, stepped forward. "Alden," she said, her voice pleading, "tell them. Tell them everything. It's the only way to make amends." Croft looked at his wife, his eyes filled with a mixture of resentment and despair. He knew he had lost her, lost everything. He had nothing left to protect. "She's in a sanatorium," he finally said, his voice barely a whisper, "near St. Louis, a private institution for the mentally unstable." Lila felt a wave of shock wash over her. Her mother alive, but in prison, in a sanatorium? It was a cruel twist of fate, a fate worse than death, perhaps. "What's the name of the institution?" Theo asked, his voice urgent. Croft hesitated again, then finally spoke the name, a name that sounded like a death knell. "The Havenwood Retreat," he said. The name echoed in the stillness of the night, a chilling revelation. Lila's mother, the woman she had never known, the woman who had haunted her dreams, was alive, but she was not free. She was trapped, hidden away, a victim of the shadow's ruthless machinations. And Thomas, the oppressed? What happened to him? Where is he? Croft's face hardened. "I don't know," he said. "I truly don't. After Carver Sr. stopped paying, after Eleanor was taken care of, Thomas was no longer our concern." "You abandoned him?" Lila asked, her voice filled with disbelief. "You just left him?" Croft shrugged, a gesture of indifference that sent a surge of rage through Lila. "He was a pawn, Miss Moreau," he said. "Nothing more. A means to an end." He was lying, Lila knew. He was still hiding something. He knew what had happened to Thomas, but he was refusing to reveal it. Theo stepped forward, his fists clenched. "You'll tell us," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You'll tell us everything." But before Theo could act, Mrs. Croft intervened. "No, Theodore," she said, her voice surprisingly firm. "Violence won't solve anything. It won't bring back the past. It won't bring peace." She turned to her husband, her eyes filled with a mixture of pity and disgust. "You've done enough damage, Alden," she said. "You've ruined enough lives. It's time. It's time for it to end." She looked at Lila, her expression softening. I can't imagine what you've been through, Miss Moreau," she said. "But I want to help you. I want to help you find your brother if he's still alive. I want to atone for my husband's sins, for my own complicity." It was an unexpected offer, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. Lila looked at Mrs. Croft, at her genuine remorse, at her willingness to help. Could she trust her? Could she trust anyone connected to Alden Croft, to the shadow? But she had no choice. She needed all the help she could get. She needed to find her mother, to free her from the sanatorium. And she needed to find Thomas, her lost brother, if he was still alive. "Thank you, Mrs. Croft," Lila said, her voice trembling. I accept your offer. I need your help." A promise had been made, a promise in the dark, a promise fueled by guilt, by remorse, by a desperate hope for redemption. The journey to St. Louis, to the Havenwood Retreat, would be a perilous one, a journey into the heart of darkness. But Lila was ready. She was determined to face whatever awaited her, to uncover the final secrets, to bring her mother home, and to find her brother, no matter the cost. Chapter 13. Shattered Reflections. The drive to St. Louis was long and tense, filled with a heavy silence that spoke volumes. Theo drove, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his jaw tight with determination. Lila sat beside him, staring out the window, her mind racing, replaying Croft's confession. the shocking revelation about her mother's fate. Mrs. Croft had insisted on accompanying them, offering her assistance and, perhaps more importantly, a semblance of legitimacy should they encounter resistance at Havenwood. She sat in the back, a quiet, almost ghostly presence. The Havenwood retreat was nestled in the rolling hills outside St. Louis, a sprawling estate surrounded by high walls and imposing gates. It looked more like a fortress than a sanctuary, a place designed to keep people in rather than to heal them. The overcast sky and the chill in the air added to the sense of foreboding that settled over Lila as they approached. Mrs. Croft, using her name and her late husband's reputation, a cruel irony, Lila thought, managed to gain them entry. The director of the institution, Dr. Albright, was a smooth, unctuous man who greeted them with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He listened politely as Mrs. Croft explained their request to see Eleanor Moreau, a patient who had been admitted over 20 years ago. Dr. Albright's smile faltered slightly. "Mrs. Moreau," he said, his voice hesitant. "That's a rather unusual request. She's been a resident here for a very long time. She's not had any visitors in many years." "We're family," Theo interjected, his voice firm. "We have a right to see her." Dr. Albright hesitated again, his gaze shifting between them, assessing them, calculating his options. He was clearly reluctant, but he also knew that he couldn't simply refuse them, not with Mrs. Croft's presence and Theo's implied threat. "Very well," he said finally. "But I must warn you, Mrs. Moreau is not well. She's fragile. She may not recognize you. She may not even be able to communicate." His words sent a shiver of fear through Lila. She had prepared herself for the worst, but the reality of her mother's condition, her long years of confinement, was a crushing blow. Dr. Albright led them through a series of long, sterile corridors, the air thick with the smell of antiseptic and a faint, unsettling odor of decay. The silence was broken only by the occasional muffled cry or a distant, echoing moan. It was a place of despair, a place where hope had died. Finally, they reached a small, sparsely furnished room. A single window, barred and covered with a heavy mesh screen, offered a glimpse of the gray sky outside. In the center of the room, sitting in a worn armchair, was a woman. She was small and frail, her hair white and wispy, her face lined with wrinkles, her eyes vacant and unfocused. She was dressed in a shapeless, faded gown, her hands resting limply in her lap. She looked lost, broken. "Mother?" Lila whispered, her voice trembling. The woman didn't respond. She didn't even seem to notice their presence. She simply stared straight ahead, her gaze fixed on some distant, unseen point. Lila stepped closer, her heart aching with a mixture of grief and pity. She knelt beside the woman, gently taking her hand. Her skin was thin and papery, her bones fragile beneath her touch. "Mother," Lila repeated, her voice choked with emotion. "It's me. It's Lila." Still no response. The woman remained motionless, her eyes vacant, her expression blank. Theo stepped forward, his face grim. "Eleanor," he said, his voice firm. "It's Theodore Carver. Do you remember me?" A flicker of something crossed the woman's face, a flicker of recognition, perhaps, or a flicker of fear. But it was fleeting, gone as quickly as it had appeared. Mrs. Croft, who had been standing silently by, watching them, stepped forward. "Eleanor," she said, her voice gentle. "It's Martha Croft. Do you remember me? My husband, Alden. He sent you here?" A spark ignited in Eleanor's eyes, and it burnt away the listless gaze that had been there only moments before. She recognized the name. She knew. Slowly, she turned her gaze towards the group. She looked at Theo, she studied Mrs. Croft, and when her eyes finally connected with Lila's, recognition flickered. "Lila," she whispered, her voice raspy. Lila's tears fell freely. "Yes, Mama, it is me." A weak smile formed. "My beautiful daughter." The reunion, however bittersweet, was short-lived. The exertion of speaking, of recognizing her daughter, seemed to drain Eleanor's limited energy. Her eyes closed, and she slumped back in her chair, her breathing shallow and uneven. Dr. Albright stepped forward, his expression concerned. "I'm afraid that's all she can handle for now," he said. "She's very weak. She needs to rest." Lila wanted to stay, to hold her mother's hand, to talk to her, to tell her everything. But she knew that she couldn't. She had to respect her mother's fragile condition, her need for rest. They left the room, the image of Eleanor, frail and broken, etched in their minds. The shattered reflection of Lila's hopes, of her dreams of a happy reunion, lay in pieces around her. But amidst the debris there was a spark, a flicker of hope. Her mother was alive. She had recognized her. And that, for now, was enough. The journey was far from over, but a crucial first step had been taken. The truth, however painful, was beginning to emerge from the shadows. Chapter 14. The Rhythm of Resilience. The encounter with Eleanor, however brief and heartbreaking, fueled Lila's determination. She was no longer just searching for answers. She was fighting for her mother's freedom, for a chance to reclaim the years that had been stolen from them. Theo, too, was deeply affected by the visit to Havenwood. He had never known Eleanor, but seeing her in that condition, a victim of his father's and Croft's machinations, ignited a fierce resolve within him. He was committed to helping Lila, not just out of a sense of obligation, but out of a growing affection, a connection that transcended their possible blood relation. Mrs. Croft, surprisingly, proved to be a valuable ally. Her guilt and remorse over her husband's actions fueled a genuine desire to make amends. She used her influence and her late husband's remaining resources to help Lila and Theo navigate the complex legal and bureaucratic hurdles involved in challenging Eleanor's confinement. They hired a lawyer, a sharp, ambitious woman named Sarah Jenkins, who specialized in cases involving wrongful commitment and institutional abuse. Sarah was skeptical at first, but after reviewing the evidence, Croft's confession, the blackmail letter, Eleanor's medical records obtained through Mrs. Croft's connections, she became convinced that they had a strong case. "This is outrageous," Sarah said, her voice filled with indignation. "They essentially imprisoned her, drugged her, kept her isolated for over 20 years. It's barbaric." She outlined the legal strategy. They would petition the court for Eleanor's release, arguing that she had been unjustly committed and that she posed no threat to herself or others. They would also seek damages from Croft's estate and from Havenwood, holding them accountable for their actions. The legal process was slow and arduous, filled with paperwork, depositions, and court appearances. Lila found it frustrating, overwhelming at times, but she persevered, driven by the image of her mother, trapped in that sterile room, her spirit broken, but not extinguished. Theo was a constant source of support, providing not just financial assistance, but also emotional strength. He accompanied Lila to every meeting, every court hearing, his presence a reassuring anchor in the storm. Their relationship deepened, evolving beyond the initial spark of attraction, beyond the shared quest for the truth, into something more profound, more enduring. They faced opposition, of course. Dr. Albright, fearing for his reputation and his career, vehemently denied any wrongdoing. He claimed that Eleanor was a danger to herself, that she was delusional, that she needed constant care and supervision. He produced witnesses, other doctors and nurses. who testified to Eleanor's instability, her supposed mental illness. But Lila and Theo, with Sarah's help, countered their claims. They presented evidence of Croft's confession, the blackmail letter, the photograph of Eleanor and her baby. They brought in their own experts, psychiatrists who examined Eleanor after finally gaining access through a court order, and testified that she showed no signs of psychosis, that she was lucid and coherent, that she had been unjustly confined. The turning point came during a dramatic court hearing when Mrs. Croft took the stand. She testified about her husband's confession, about his involvement in the shadow, about his ruthless ambition and his willingness to destroy anyone who stood in his way. I was blind, she said, her voice trembling. I was complicit. I didn't want to see the truth, but I see it now. And I know that Eleanor Moreau was a victim, just like so many others. Her testimony was a devastating blow to Dr. Albright's defense. It was clear that the tide had turned, that the truth was finally emerging. After weeks of legal wrangling, the judge finally issued his ruling. He ordered Eleanor Moreau's immediate release from Havenwood, stating that her commitment had been unjust, that she had been denied her fundamental rights, that she had been the victim of a cruel and deliberate conspiracy. Lila wept with relief, with joy, with a profound sense of gratitude. Her mother was free. After over 20 years of imprisonment, of isolation, of despair, she was finally free. The rhythm of resilience, the beat of hope that had sustained Lila through the darkest days, had finally reached its crescendo. The shadows were receding, the light was returning, and a new chapter was about to begin. The victory was sweet, but it was also bittersweet. The years that had been lost could never be regained. The scars that had been inflicted would never fully heal. But Eleanor was alive, and she was free. And that, for Lila, was all that mattered. Chapter 15. Unmasking the Truth. Eleanor's release from Havenwood was a momentous occasion, filled with a mixture of joy, relief, and a profound sense of unease. While she was physically free, the years of confinement and medication had taken their toll. She was frail, both physically and emotionally, and she struggled to adjust to the outside world. Lila, with Theo's unwavering support, dedicated herself to her mother's care. They found a small, comfortable apartment for Eleanor in a quiet neighborhood, far from the city's noise and chaos. They hired a nurse, a kind, compassionate woman named Mary, to help with Eleanor's medical needs and to provide companionship. The initial days were difficult. Eleanor was withdrawn, often disoriented, and she struggled to remember details about her past. The trauma of her confinement, the forced separation from her child, had left deep scars. Lila spent hours with her, talking to her, reading to her, playing her old records, trying to coax her back to the present, to help her reconnect with the world. Slowly, gradually, Eleanor began to improve. She started to remember things, fragments of her life before Havenwood, her love of music, her brief, passionate relationship with Carver Sr. She remembered Lila, her daughter, the child she had been forced to abandon. You look like him," she said one day, her voice raspy but filled with a hint of wonder. "You have his eyes." She was referring to Carver Sr., Lila knew. It was a bittersweet observation, a reminder of the man who had both loved and betrayed her mother. As Eleanor's memory improved, Lila started to ask her questions, gently probing for information about the shadow, about her brother Thomas. She knew it was a delicate process, that pushing too hard could be damaging, but she also knew that Eleanor held the key to unlocking the final secrets, to finding her lost brother. "Do you remember anything about the shadow mother?" Lila asked one afternoon as they sat together in the apartment's small, sunlit living room. Eleanor's brow furrowed, her eyes clouding with confusion. "Shadows," she whispered. "Dark, dangerous. They took him. They took my baby." Thomas? Lila prompted, her heart pounding. They took Thomas. Do you remember who they were? Where they took him? Eleanor shook her head, her face contorted with frustration. I don't know, she said. I can't remember. It was a long time ago. Lila felt a surge of disappointment, but she didn't give up. She continued to talk to her mother, to show her old photographs, to play her music, hoping to trigger a memory, to unlock the secrets that were buried deep within her mind. One evening, as Lila was playing a record of Eleanor's favorite blues singer, Bessie Smith, Eleanor suddenly sat up, her eyes widening with recognition. The club, she exclaimed, her voice surprisingly strong. The Nightingale. I remember. Lila's heart leaped with hope. The Nightingale. It was a connection, a thread to follow. What about the Nightingale, Mother? Lila asked, her voice urgent. What do you remember? Eleanor closed her eyes, concentrating, her brow furrowed in effort. A man, she whispered. A man with a scar. He came to the club. He talked to me. A scar. Lila remembered Silas, the underworld contact, mentioning a scar when describing some powerful members of the Chicago underworld. Could this be the same man? What did he say, Mother? Lila pressed. What did he want? Eleanor's breathing became shallow and uneven, her face pale with fear. He threatened me, she whispered. He said if I didn't cooperate, they would hurt my baby. She started to tremble, her body shaking with the force of the memory. Lila quickly turned off the music, gently taking her mother's hand. It's all right, Mother, she said, her voice soothing. You're safe now. You're with me. Eleanor clung to Lila's hand, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and gratitude. They took him, Lila, she whispered. They took my Thomas. And I never saw him again. The memory, so vivid, so painful, had finally surfaced. Eleanor had remembered the man with the scar, the threat, the abduction of her child. It was a crucial piece of the puzzle, a lead that could help them find Thomas. Lila knew what she had to do. She had to find Silas, the underworld contact, the man who knew the secrets of the shadow. She had to ask him about the man with the scar, about Thomas, about the organization that had destroyed her family. The unmasking of the truth was about to begin. The final secrets were about to be revealed. Lila, armed with her mother's memories and her own unwavering determination, was ready to confront the shadows, to bring justice to her family, and to find her lost brother, no matter the cost. The rhythm of resilience had led her this far, and she wouldn't stop until the music finally reached its resolution. Chapter 16. A Waltz of Danger. Finding Silas again proved to be a challenge. He was a creature of the shadows, a man who moved in the murky underworld of Chicago, and he wasn't easily accessible. Lila, using her contacts from her days at the Nightingale, started asking questions, discreetly probing for information about his whereabouts. Theo, meanwhile, used his own connections, leveraging his family's name and his own considerable resources to track down the elusive fixer. After several days of searching, they finally received a lead. Silas was known to frequent a particular gambling den, a hidden establishment located beneath a seemingly innocuous tailor shop in a less than savory part of town. They decided to go there that night, knowing that it was a risky move, that they were stepping into dangerous territory. But they were running out of options, and Lila was desperate to find out what Silas knew about her brother, about the man with the scar. The gambling den was a dimly lit, smoke-filled room filled with the sounds of clinking chips, shuffling cards, and hushed conversations. The air was thick with tension, with the smell of stale beer and desperation. Men in sharp suits and women in glittering gowns huddled around the tables, their faces etched with a mixture of greed and anxiety. Lila and Theo stood out amidst the crowd, their presence drawing curious glances. They were clearly not regulars, not part of this world, but they moved with a confidence, a determination that commanded respect. They found Silas in a back room playing poker with a group of hardened-looking men. He looked up as they approached, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "Mr. Carver," he said, his voice a low growl. "Miss Moreau, what brings you to my establishment?" "We need to talk to you, Silas," Theo said, his voice firm. "About the shadow, about Lila's brother." Silas gestured towards a pair of empty chairs. "Sit down," he said. "But be quick. I'm in the middle of a game." They sat, the tension in the room palpable. Lila leaned forward, her gaze fixed on Silas. "My mother, she remembered something," she said. "She remembered a man with a scar, who threatened her, who took her baby." Silas's eyes flickered, a hint of recognition, perhaps, or a flicker of apprehension. "So?" he said, his voice non-committal. "You know who he is, don't you?" Lila pressed. "You know what happened to Thomas." Silas hesitated, his gaze shifting towards the other men at the table. They were watching him, their expressions guarded, their hands hovering near their pockets, a clear warning. "I told you before," Silas said, his voice low and menacing. "Some things are best left buried. Some questions are best left unanswered." My brother is not a thing," Lila retorted, her voice rising. "He's a person. He's my family, and I want to know what happened to him." Silas sighed, a weary, resigned sound. "You're persistent, Miss Moreau," he said. "I'll give you that. But you're also foolish. You're stirring up things that are best left undisturbed." He paused, his gaze sweeping over them, assessing them, calculating his options. "The man with the scar," he finally said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "His name was Victor Martel. He was a lieutenant in the shadow, a ruthless man, a dangerous man." "Was?" Theo questioned, his voice sharp. "What happened to him?" Silas shrugged. "He disappeared," he said, "years ago. Some say he was killed. Others say he retired. No one knows for sure." "And Thomas?" Lila asked, her voice urgent. "What happened to him after Martel took him?" Silas hesitated again, his gaze shifting away. I don't know," he said. "I truly don't. Martel, he was responsible for handling those matters. He kept things close to the vest. He was lying, Lila knew. He knew more than he was letting on. But she also knew that she couldn't force it out of him. Not here, not now. "There's something else," Silas said, changing the subject. "Something you should know." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. "The shadow, they're still out there," he said. "They may be, dormant, but they're not gone, and they're watching you, both of you." Lila felt a chill run down her spine. Silas's words were a warning, a clear indication that they were in danger, that their quest for the truth had put them in the crosshairs of a powerful, ruthless organization. "They know about your investigation," Silas continued. "They know about your visit to Croft. They know about your mother's release, and they're not happy." "What do they want?" Theo asked, his voice grim. Silas shook his head. "They want you to stop," he said. "They want you to forget about the past. They want you to disappear." He stood up, signaling that the meeting was over. "I've told you all I can," he said. "Now get out of here, and be careful. You're dancing with danger, Miss Moreau. And the music, it's about to stop." They left the gambling den, the weight of Silas's words heavy on their shoulders. They were no closer to finding Thomas, but they had learned something important. They knew the name of the man with the scar, Victor Martel, and they knew that the shadow was still a threat, that they were being watched, that their lives were in danger. As they walked back to Theo's car, Lila felt a surge of fear, but it was mixed with a renewed determination. She wouldn't give up. She wouldn't be intimidated. She would find her brother, and she would expose the shadow, no matter the cost. The waltz of danger was far from over, but she was ready to dance, to fight, to the very end. The rhythm of resilience, the beat of hope, still pulsed within her stronger than ever before. Chapter 17. The Heart's Crescendo. Silas's warning, far from deterring them, galvanized Lila and Theo. They knew they were walking a tightrope, that one wrong step could have dire consequences, but they were determined to uncover the truth about Thomas and expose the shadow. They decided to focus their efforts on finding out what happened to Victor Martel, the man with the scar who had abducted Lila's brother. If Martel was dead, as Silas had suggested, there might be records, a paper trail, that could lead them to Thomas. If he was alive, finding him was their best hope of getting answers. Theo, using his resources and connections, started investigating Martel's known associates, his past haunts, any place or person that might provide a clue to his whereabouts or his fate. Lila, meanwhile, focused on the shadow itself, researching its history, its members, its operations, hoping to find a weakness, a vulnerability that they could exploit. They worked tirelessly, driven by a shared sense of urgency, by a growing fear that time was running out. They knew that the shadow was watching them, that their every move was being monitored, and that they had to be careful, discreet, but also relentless. As they worked together, their bond deepened, their relationship evolving beyond the initial spark of attraction, beyond the shared quest for the truths, into something profound and enduring. They had become more than partners, more than allies. They had become each other's confidants, each other's support, each other's strength. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace in Theo's apartment, reviewing documents and sharing information, Theo paused, his gaze fixed on Lila. "Lila," he said, his voice low and intimate. I need to tell you something." Lila looked at him, her heart pounding. She knew what was coming. She had felt it building between them, the unspoken words, the longing glances, the undeniable connection. I'm in love with you," Theo said, his voice trembling slightly. "I know it's complicated. The possibility that we might be related, it's a lot to process, but I can't deny my feelings any longer." Lila's breath caught in her throat. She had known. She had felt it too. But hearing the words spoken aloud, the raw emotion in Theo's voice, sent a wave of warmth through her, a feeling of joy, of relief, of hope. "I love you too, Theo," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I have for a while now." He reached out and gently took her hand, his touch sending a shiver of electricity through her. He leaned closer, his eyes searching hers, his gaze filled with a tenderness, a longing that took her breath away. He kissed her then, a kiss that was both passionate and gentle, a kiss that sealed their bond, a kiss that promised a future together, no matter what challenges lay ahead. The kiss, the confession of love, was a turning point, a moment of clarity amidst the chaos and uncertainty that surrounded them. It gave them renewed strength, renewed determination to face whatever came next. The next day, they received a breakthrough. Theo's investigation to Victor Martel had yielded a promising lead. He had discovered that Martel had a sister, a woman named Esme Martel, who lived in a small town in southern Illinois. "She might know something," Theo said, his voice excited. "She might know what happened to Martel, to Thomas." They decided to go to Illinois immediately to confront Esme Martel. to see if she could provide the answers they so desperately sought. The journey to the small town was filled with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. They knew they were getting closer to the truth, but they also knew that they were stepping into even greater danger. The shadow was still out there watching them, and they had no idea what awaited them in this quiet, unassuming town. As they drove, Lila couldn't help but think about her mother, about Eleanor, now recovering in the small apartment, slowly piecing her life back together. She thought about her brother, Thomas, lost and unknown, a ghost from her past, a hope for her future. She looked at Theo sitting beside her, his strong profile silhouetted against the fading light. She thought about their love, their bond, their shared quest for the truth. The heart's crescendo was building, the music swelling, the rhythm of resilience driving them forward. The final act was about to begin, and she was ready to face whatever awaited her, ready to fight for her family, for her love, for her future. Chapter 18, Redemption Song. The town of Havenwood, a cruel coincidence of name, Lila thought, was small and unassuming, a cluster of houses and shops nestled amidst rolling farmland. Esme Martel lived in a modest bungalow on the outskirts of town, a quiet, secluded place that seemed to reflect a life lived in the shadows. They arrived in the late afternoon, the setting sun casting long shadows across the landscape. The air was still and quiet, the only sound the chirping of crickets and the distant bark of a dog. Theo parked the car a short distance from the house, and they approached on foot, their steps cautious and deliberate. They knew they were walking into a potentially dangerous situation, that Esme Martel might be hostile, unwilling to cooperate or even connected to the shadow. As they neared the house, Lila noticed a figure sitting on the porch, a woman silhouetted against the fading light. She was older, her hair gray and pulled back in a tight bun, her face lined with wrinkles, her eyes watchful and wary. "Esme Martel?" Theo asked, his voice polite but firm. The woman nodded, her gaze fixed on them, her expression unreadable. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice raspy and hesitant. "My name is Theodore Carver," Theo said. "And this is Lila Moreau. We need to talk to you about your brother, Victor." Esme's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of fear, perhaps, or a flicker of recognition. She stood up, her movements slow and deliberate, and gestured towards the door. "Come inside," she said. "It's not safe to talk out here." They followed her into the house, the interior dim and sparsely furnished, the air thick with the smell of dust and old memories. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Esme led them into a small living room, gesturing towards a pair of worn armchairs. "Sit down," she said, "and tell me what you want." Lila and Theo sat, their bodies tense, their senses on high alert. They were in the lion's den, facing a woman who held the key to their past, to their future. "We know about your brother's involvement with the shadow," Theo said, his voice direct. "We know about the blackmail, about Eleanor Moreau, about the child." Esme's face paled slightly, but she didn't speak. She simply stared at them, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. "We know he took the child, Thomas," Lila said, her voice trembling slightly. "We want to know what happened to him." "Where is he?" Esme sighed, a weary, defeated sound. "Victor, he was a bad man," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He got involved with the wrong people. He did terrible things." "But what about Tama?" Lila pressed. "What happened to him?" Esme hesitated, her gaze shifting away. "Victor, he brought the child here," she said. "Years ago, he left him with me." Lila's heart leaped with hope. "He's here?" she asked. her voice rising. "Thomas is here? He's alive?" Esme shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "No," she said. "He's not here. Not anymore. Victor, he came back. He took him away again." Lila felt a wave of disappointment wash over her, a crushing sense of loss. "Where did he take him?" she asked, her voice desperate. "Where is he?" Esme looked at her, her eyes filled with a deep, profound sadness. "I don't know," she said. "I truly don't. Victor, he never told me. He just took him. And I never saw either of them again." She paused, her gaze shifting towards a framed photograph on a nearby table. It showed a young boy, smiling and carefree, his eyes bright with innocence. "That's him," Esme said, her voice trembling. "That's Thomas, the only picture I have of him." Lila walked over to the table, her hand reaching out to touch the photograph. It was her brother, her lost brother, a face she had never known, a life that had been stolen. "He looks like you," Theo said, his voice soft, his hand gently touching Lila's shoulder. Lila nodded, her eyes filled with tears. She looked at the photograph, at the innocent face of her brother, and she felt a surge of determination, a renewed resolve to find him, to bring him home. Esme, watching them, seemed to reach a decision. She stood up, her movements slow but deliberate, and walked over to a small wooden chest in the corner of the room. "There's something you should see," she said. "Something Victor left behind." She opened the chest, revealing a collection of papers, documents, and photographs. It was Victor Martel's legacy, the remnants of a life lived in the shadows, a life of violence and deceit. I never looked at these things," Esme said. I didn't want to know, but maybe there's something here, something that can help you." Lila and Theo started sifting through the contents of the chest, their hearts pounding with anticipation. They were on the verge of a breakthrough, on the cusp of uncovering the final secrets, of finding Thomas, of bringing redemption to their families. The song of redemption was playing, the rhythm of resilience driving them forward, the hope for a happy ending finally within their grasp. Chapter 19. Carving a New Destiny. The contents of Victor Martel's chest were a treasure trove of information, a dark and twisted chronicle of his life within the shadow. There were ledgers detailing illicit transactions, letters outlining blackmail schemes, and photographs of Martel with various underworld figures, some recognizable, others unknown. As Lila and Theo meticulously examined each item, they began to piece together a clearer picture of Martel's activities, his rise within the shadow, and his eventual downfall. They found evidence of his involvement in numerous criminal enterprises, including bootlegging, gambling, and extortion. They also found confirmation of his role in the blackmail of Carver Sr. and the abduction of Thomas. But it was a small, unassuming notebook, tucked away at the bottom of the chest, that held the key to Thomas's fate. The notebook was filled with Martel's cryptic notes, written in a coded language that was initially difficult to decipher. But Theo, with his knowledge of his father's business dealings and his own sharp intellect, recognized some of the symbols and phrases. "This is a code," he said, his voice excited. "My father used a similar system in some of his confidential correspondence. I think I can break it." He spent hours working on the code, painstakingly deciphering each entry, slowly unraveling the secrets that Martel had so carefully guarded. Lila watched him, her heart pounding with anticipation, her hope growing with each decoded word, each revealed phrase. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Theo looked up, his face pale, but his eyes shining with a mixture of triumph and disbelief. "I've got it," he said, his voice trembling. "I know what happened to Thomas." He pointed to a specific entry in the notebook, a series of coded words and numbers that, when deciphered, revealed a shocking truth. Martel didn't kill him, Theo said. He gave him away. He sold him to a wealthy family in Europe. Lila gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Sold? Her brother had been sold, like a piece of property? Like a commodity? Who? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Who bought him? Theo pointed to another entry in the notebook, a name that was both familiar and unexpected. The Moreau family, he said. A distant branch. Relatives of your mother living in France. Lila's mind reeled. Her own family? A distant branch she had never known? They had bought her brother? It was unbelievable. A cruel twist of fate. A revelation that changed everything. They contacted a lawyer and got to work to bring Thomas back home. Several weeks later, a tall, handsome man with familiar eyes stepped off a ship in New York Harbor. He was Thomas Moreau, or rather, Thomas Martel, the lost brother and the stolen child, finally returned to his rightful family. The reunion was emotional, filled with tears, with embraces, with a profound sense of relief and joy. Lila and Thomas, strangers yet siblings, connected instantly. Their bond forged in shared blood, in shared history, in a shared destiny. Eleanor met her son for the first time since he was a baby, and her mind completely healed. Theo and Lila, their quest for the truth finally fulfilled, their love solidified by the trials they had overcome, stood together, watching the reunion, their hearts filled with a happiness they had never thought possible. They decided to stay in America. The shadow, its secrets exposed, its power diminished, began to crumble. Croft's confession, Mrs. Croft's testimony, and the evidence found in Martel's chest led to arrests, indictments, and the dismantling of the organization that had haunted their lives. Lila and Theo, free from the shadows of the past, looked towards the future, a future filled with promise, with hope, with a love that had blossomed amidst the darkness. They had carved a new destiny, a destiny forged in resilience, in courage, in the unwavering belief in the power of truth and the enduring strength of family. The music had reached its crescendo. The rhythm of resilience had led them to a triumphant resolution, and a new song, a song of love, of hope, of happiness, was just beginning. Chapter 20. Two Souls Entwined. The months following Thomas's return were a time of healing, of reconnection, of building new lives and forging new bonds. Eleanor, revitalized by the reunion with her son, continued to improve, her memory returning, her spirit rekindled. She moved into a small cottage near Lila and Theo, her days filled with laughter, with music, with the love of her reunited family. Thomas, adapting remarkably well to his new life, embraced his American heritage with enthusiasm. He was a charming, intelligent young man with a quick wit and a warm heart. He and Lila developed a close sibling bond, their connection immediate and profound, as if the years of separation had never existed. He took an interest to learn Theo's business. Lila and Theo, their love deepened by the trials they had overcome, decided to marry. It was a small, intimate ceremony, held in the garden of Theo's estate, overlooking the shimmering expanse of Lake Michigan. Eleanor and Thomas stood beside them, their faces radiant with happiness, their presence a testament to the enduring power of family, of love, of resilience. Lila wore a simple, elegant gown of ivory silk, her dark hair adorned with a single white gardenia. Theo, in a classic tuxedo, looked at her with a love and adoration that took her breath away. They exchanged vows, their voices filled with emotion, their promises echoing across the tranquil waters, a symbol of their enduring commitment, their unwavering devotion. As they were pronounced husband and wife, a cheer erupted from the small gathering of friends and family. The sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden glow over the scene, a blessing on their union, a promise of a bright future. After the ceremony, there was a reception, a joyous celebration, filled with music, with laughter, with dancing. Lila, taking a break from the festivities, found herself standing on the balcony, overlooking the lake, her thoughts drifting back to the beginning of her journey, to the smoky nightclub, the velvet spotlight, the fateful encounter that had changed her life forever. Theo joined her, his arm gently wrapping around her waist, his presence a comforting anchor, a symbol of their enduring love. "A penny for your thoughts," he said, his voice soft and intimate. Lila smiled, leaning to his embrace. "I was just thinking about how much has changed," she said. "About how unbelievable it all seems." Theo nodded, his gaze following hers towards the shimmering expanse of the lake. "It's been a journey," he said. "A long and difficult one. But we made it. We found our way through the darkness and into the light. Together," Lila added, her voice filled with gratitude. He kissed her then, a tender, loving kiss that sealed their bond, a kiss that promised a lifetime of happiness, of shared dreams, of unwavering devotion. As they stood there, embraced in each other's arms, the music from the reception drifted towards them. A lively jazz tune, a reminder of their past, of the journey that had brought them together. But it was also a promise of the future, a future filled with music, with laughter, with love. Lila, her heart filled with a joy she had never thought possible, knew that she had finally found her place in the world, her true home, her enduring love. She had overcome the shadows of her past. She had found her family, and she had found the man who completed her, the man who would share her life, her dreams, her future. Two souls, once lost and adrift, had found each other amidst the chaos and uncertainty of the jazz age, their destinies intertwined, their love a beacon of hope, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. Their song had reached its triumphant conclusion. The rhythm of resilience had led them to a happy ending, and a new chapter, a chapter filled with love, with laughter, with endless possibilities, was just beginning. The triumph of two souls indeed. Epilogue. Epilogue. 5 years later, the echoes of the jazz age had faded, replaced by the hum of a new era, an era of rebuilding, of recovery, of cautious optimism. The scars of the past remained, etched in memory, but they were no longer open wounds. They were reminders of the resilience of the human spirit, of the power of love and family to overcome even the darkest of shadows. Lila and Theo stood on the deck of a magnificent yacht, the Eleanor. It was named for Lila's mother as a sign of respect and honor. They were sailing on Lake Michigan. Lila, her dark hair now styled in a chic bob, her eyes sparkling with happiness, held a toddler in her arms, a beautiful little girl with her father's gray eyes and her mother's mischievous smile. Her name was Eleanor, after the grandmother she adored. Theo, his arm around Lila's waist, his gaze filled with a love that had only deepened with time, watched his daughter with a mixture of pride and adoration. He had become a successful businessman, his integrity and his compassion earning him the respect of his peers, his family's legacy redeemed, his own destiny fulfilled. Thomas, now a confident and successful young man, stood nearby, chatting with his wife Clara. Clara Beaumont Carver, a reformed socialite, her venom replaced by a genuine warmth, a genuine desire to make amends for the sins of her past. She and Thomas had found an unexpected connection, a shared understanding, a love that had blossomed amidst the ashes of old rivalries and past betrayals. Eleanor, now a vibrant and active woman, her spirit fully restored, sat nearby, playing with her granddaughter, her laughter echoing across the tranquil waters. She had found peace, she had found happiness, and she had found a family that cherished her, that loved her unconditionally. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the lake, Lila looked around at her family, her heart overflowing with gratitude. She had come so far, from the orphaned girl with a voice like velvet, to the successful singer, to the woman who had faced down the shadows of her past, to the wife and mother, surrounded by love, by happiness, by a family she had never thought possible. The journey had been long and arduous, filled with danger, with uncertainty, with heartbreak. But it had also been filled with love, with courage, with resilience. She had found her voice, she had found her family, and she had found her true love. As the last rays of the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with vibrant hues of orange and purple, Lila leaned into Theo's embrace, her daughter nestled safely in her arms, her family surrounding her, her heart filled with a peace, a contentment that she had never known before. The music of the jazz age had faded, but the rhythm of resilience, the song of love, continued to play, a timeless melody, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, a promise of a future filled with hope, with happiness, with endless possibilities. The journey was over. The shadows had been banished, and a new era, an era of love, of family, of enduring happiness, had begun. The end.